We were the kids from the wrong side of the tracks, entangled with the wrong kind of people. A handful of screw-ups led us to the employ of the local drug lord. It started off simple enough. Deliver this here, deliver that there. But despite our best efforts, we sank further and further into the mire. Sometimes the four of us would daydream together, dreaming of a life where we weren't high school dropouts and weren't up to our necks in illegal activities. Red wanted his own bar. Jackson wanted to wear a suit to work. Neil wished for a home with a white picket fence and a sweet little blonde to welcome him there. I just wished we could live a life where we weren't always looking over our shoulders. The shit really hit the fan when someone started moving on the boss's territory. He wasn't pleased and sent in enforcers to take care of the little problem. Except they never came back. So he sent another crew. When they failed to return, he sent out the Breakers. They were the biggest, meanest motherfuckers to walk the planet. They were generally the boss's security detail. We called them the Breakers because they had a tendency to break men, their bones, their bodies, their general will to live. 5 minutes with the Breakers would have you spilling your guts like Chunk from the Goonies, only much bloodier. Only one returned. He was a mess. The only thing holding his guts in place was the broken hand he kept firmly over the gaping hole in his belly. "Boss, it's not worth it. Just let Mr. Lucky have it all. Take your family and leave," he gasped. The boss wasn't having it. He shot the lone breaker through his kneecap. The man didn't even have the energy to scream, nor the blood to bleed. He shakily offered up an old Nokia, sticky with rusty red. "You don't understand," the breaker wheezed out, the life beginning to fade from his eyes. "He's called Mr. Lucky for a reason. Everything we threw at him, it just... The phone clattered to the ground as the life left the broken breaker, along with the remainder of his bodily fluids. The sight of the terrifying man dead on the floor, surrounded by blood and urine, limp like a rag doll, will haunt my nightmares as long as I live, no matter how long or short that may be. We all stared in confusion as the Nokia began to ring. Red picked it up and answered with a shaky, "Hello?" He listened for a minute and his eyes grew wide as he held the phone out. "It's for you, boss. It's Mr. Lucky." The boss snatched the phone from Red. "You've got 1 day to get the fuck out of my..." All the color drained out of his face. "Impossible!" The color returned to his face in a flash. His full cheeks grew scarlet in anger, and his eyes bulged out. "You wouldn't dare!" He stared down at the phone. Fear and fury filled his tomato-red visage. "Get everyone! Bring everything we got!" We stared at each other in confusion. "Now!" he shouted, before turning on his heel and running to his office, slamming the door. All that was left was a mere handful of men. The boss liked to run a small but powerful business. The fewer people you had, the fewer there were to betray you. Counting us, we were 15 men, plus the boss. That meant we'd lost 20. Fear pricked at my skin, causing the hairs to raise on the back of my neck in a tidal wave of goose flesh. The warehouse we pulled up to looked dark, dank, and repulsive. Not a single window pane remained unbroken. It seemed as if the sun itself hadn't shone on this lot in years. Even grass dared not grow through the broken asphalt where we parked our vans. I would paint the scene that met our eyes when we entered that warehouse, but I would need a canvas of corpses and a masterpiece of carnage. The bodies of my former associates littered the floor. Blood had pooled and dried, chaotic stepping stones leading through a garden of slaughter. In the center of the putrid room, bound to a chair under the sole light hanging from the darkness beyond, was the boss's only son. At 16, he was only a few years younger than us. One eye swollen shut with a single crimson tear slowly trailing down his bruised cheek. The other eye bulged out at us, filled with fear. The straps of the ball gag pulled tightly at his mouth, tearing the corners of his lips and displaying the broken teeth clamping onto the vulgar red ball. His lips were split in many places. Salty tears and mucus tracking through the dried blood left globs of gore down his front. Every single finger had been broken and stuck out in unnatural angles. As I choked down the bile rising in my throat, Neil retched beside me. "So you've finally arrived," came a deep baritone from the shadows behind the boy. Mr. Lucky sauntered into the dim light, both hands clasped behind his back. His gray pinstripe suit was impeccable. The deep burgundy ascot around his neck was tucked neatly into a steel gray vest. An emerald green four-leaf clover brooch flashed and gleamed against the dark vermilion. He pulled his hand to his front and examined a cufflink before stuffing his hands into his pant pockets. "This is how this will go down. You will turn over your territories to me, and your boy," he smiled broadly, showing his gleaming pearly whites as he gestured towards the frightened kid, "goes free. Or you can attempt to regain your throne, and you will all die." Mr. Lucky shrugged and then offered his hand to the boss. "Kill him," was all the boss said before we opened fire. Jackson rushed to the boy and struggled with his bonds. Not a single bullet hit Mr. Lucky. Through the crossfire of 18 guns going off wildly, 2 men fell. One gun backfired and killed its wielder. Bullets sprayed and ricocheted until only the 7 of us remained. Mr. Lucky, the boss, his son, and us 4. I watched as a wet mark spread through the crotch of Jackson's pants. Red's ear had been clipped and blood dripped down onto his collar. Neil stood frozen, still pulling his trigger. The click, click, click of the empty gun was the only sound in the room until Mr. Lucky pulled out a butterfly knife and rammed it down through Jackson's hand and into the kid's leg. Both howled in pain, the kid barely squealing out through the ball gag. "And now you will all die," Mr. Lucky said matter-of-factually. 3 things happened at once. The first, an extremely loud gunshot echoed through the large room. Second, the bullet that was fired from that vengeful gun exploded the right half of the boss's head and tore through Mr. Lucky's throat, splattering blood across my face and raining more gore upon the kid's head. And third, our 5 remaining lives were irreparably changed for the rest of our lives. Each footstep that sounded behind us brought a shiver of fear as it brought the man cloaked in darkness closer. A dirty black bandana kept his unruly blonde hair from his cold brown eyes. He barely cast a glance our way before leaning over the still gurgling Mr. Lucky. The faintest scent of clove followed in his wake. "I'll take this," the man growled at Mr. Lucky as he ripped the clover brooch from his still warm body and dropped it into his own pocket. Placing his fingers on the kid's neck, he nodded. "He'll live." Jackson pulled the knife from his hand and the kid's leg and feebly brandished it at the man. He snorted. "Really?" We all watched in silence as he rolled up his sleeves, revealing strangely scarred and tattooed arms. Kneeling down, he plunged his hand into Mr. Lucky's neck. The man struggled for a brief second before he stilled for the last time. The man stood and raised his viscera-covered hand to the light and examined a bullet he had pulled from Mr. Lucky. He seemed satisfied and turned to leave. It was then I finally noticed the rifle slung over his shoulder by a strap. While it looked ancient, it explained the explosive bang that had heralded the grisly arrival of Mr. Lucky's death. He definitely wasn't so lucky now. He paused as he kicked open the warehouse door. Daylight shone beyond the darkness, highlighting the scar that ran nearly the length of the left side of his face. "You guys coming or what? I could use some help." The 4 of us exchanged glances before we scurried after the strange man, leaving the kid unconscious, but alive. Of course, once we were a safe distance away, we called in an anonymous tip about that warehouse. The kid lived. He spent a long time in a mental hospital, but he lived, nonetheless. Sometimes I look back and wonder what would have happened if we hadn't followed Kincade out of that warehouse. Despite our beginnings, he was good to us. The jobs he offered us, though, well, they weren't what we were expecting. It's strange how we started off like the knockaround guys and ended up like some fucked up version of the Winchesters, but I'll get into that later. You see, Mr. K, or Kincade like he asked us to call him, was a museum curator. He collected and displayed occult oddities, as he was apt to call them. Strange things from monkey paws to Mjolnir. We don't actually have Mjolnir yet, but it's on the list. In Mr. K's office is a wall that's covered in a map of the world. Little pins adorn it like jewels. Each pin has a number, and each number has a file. Each file is a job. The jobs are crazy and weird. For A322, we climbed a mountain and made a giant, and I mean giant, summoning circle. It took us 5 months to complete it. When we were done, we told Mr. K that nothing happened. He laughed at us. Of course not. That one will take at least 10 years to mature and power up. Mr. K took most of the jobs that were requisitions. At his side was always his trusty Miramasa, a rifle forged in part from the metals of the legendary Juchi Yosamu blade, a bloodthirsty and cursed blade which did not discriminate as to who or what it would cut. His handful of bullets, which never lost their shape and he used over and over, were made from Yawarakai. This blade was said to have been made by Masamune himself, a gentle and fine blade that did not needlessly cut down that which was innocent or undeserving. Together, the cursed rifle and the blessed bullets, they became an inescapable condemnation of death for anything that caught itself within Miramasa's sights. Mr. K had been out for a job for an unusually long time. We weren't all that concerned and just focused on the list. We were to be acquiring soul stakes. We had an address and a note attached. Don't be fooled by her lack of vision. She still sees all. As we were setting out, we were stopped by a profusely sweating FedEx driver struggling with an inordinately large package. Neil signed for it and lugged it into our receiving bay. Inside was Miramasa, a very large blue egg, and a letter. Mr. K explained in the brief note that something had come up that he had to attend to. We were to continue with the pins until they were complete. Miramasa was to help with collections. If he had not returned by then, he left us an address to find him at, but only after all jobs were completed. As for the egg, we were to give it to the sirens and harpies in the moon pool room and ask them to raise it should it hatch. "Not it," yelled Red, hefting his go back over his shoulder and placing a finger on his nose. We all followed suit, me being the last to touch my nose. "Of course," I sighed. It had been a massive struggle to even get the ladies into the moon pool room to begin with. Soundproofed walls and 6-inch thick bulletproof glass surrounded the prettiest room in the museum. They were not pleased when they found their voices could not be heard outside the room. Most normal guests of the museum thought our girls to be magnificently costumed actresses. Those in the know knew better. How Mr. K had survived, or even managed to capture them, was all thanks to the lucky clover brooch. The room was beautiful. The ceiling rose 3 stories high, with large mammoth-sized trees surrounding an Olympic-sized pool made to look like a natural hot spring. Gentle boughs of willow caressed the waters on the far side of the pool, nearly hiding the entrance to a small cave-like feature the sirens called home. The harpies had made their abode high up in the trees in a gargantuan nest. At night, the moon would bless the room with its light, shining down through the thick glass skylight. The pool would come alive with a soft, effervescent blue glow that nearly matched the color of the egg I now carried to the room. I'd have to pass through 3 sets of heavy-duty vault-like doors, each inscribed with protection runes to keep the girls inside. Through the first door, you'd find sets of sound-blocking headphones, earplugs, and the lucky clover. All 3 were required to enter the rooms beyond. Imagine my surprise when the brooch was nowhere to be found. "Yo, Red, you seen the clover?" "Last I saw it, Mr. K had it." "Damn, must have taken it with him." With the plugs wedged firmly into my ear canals and the headphones safely covering my lobes, Jackson, Neil, and I went through the second set of doors. Red firmly locking us in from the first. Neil took up his post at the second door, also locking it after Jackson and I went through. Jackson's gray eyes met mine as he lifted an eyebrow. I nodded my head in assent as the egg weighed heavy in my arms. The grass beneath my shoes squelched as I stepped through into the room. A soft gust of air ruffled my hair when the third door locked behind me. Don't show them fear, and they won't get scared either, I told myself. Cautiously, I made my way toward the pool. Ladies, I know you're watching me. Mr. K has sent you a present. I felt a tremor in the ground as Alo landed beside me. It always gave me the shivers when she'd cock her head at me in that twitchy way that birds do. I could see her lips moving and her eyes twinkling mischievously, but I couldn't hear her words. Thelxie poked her head out from the cave. Her long sandpiper legs carried her quickly to us. Her eyes opened wide and she dropped the harp she had tucked under one arm. Opalescent feathers trembled with excitement as she reached for the egg in my arms. For the first time ever, both women smiled genuine smiles at me as my headphones were plucked from my noggin. Tricky Jaime stood behind me. Terrified of her siren song, I slammed my hands over my ears. Fadarge appeared before me as I dropped to my knees. She was the smallest of the harpies. She stretched one grackle-colored wing out and stroked my arm, shaking her head no as my hands were forcefully pulled from my head and the plugs violently ripped out. Sound returned to me, terrifying in its loudness. Silly boy, you came to us without that blasted brooch. Jaime's voice flowed through me like warm liquid sunshine. I could hear Jackson banging on the door. He knew better than to open it without backup. Mouthing the words, "Don't come in," towards the security cameras, I knew my fate was sealed. Jaime, leave the boy be. You know as well as I not to bite the hand that feeds. Alo's feathers fluffed in aggression. Jaime pouted and tugged at my hair. I just wanted a little fun, cousin. Fadarge giggled at me. While she was small, she was by far the most terrifying of the lot. At some point in her long life, she had filed her teeth to sharp points and made sure to keep her talons razor sharp. She squeezed my knee with said talons. The fabric of my pants ripped, and I watched helplessly as blood began to slowly saturate the hole. Shh, demanded Thelxie. The Undine is not ready to hatch yet. Do not stress her out. Don't worry, little one. You will be safe here. Kincade may keep us confined, but he also protects us. She gently rocked the egg as she slowly made her way back to the cave, softly humming to it. Close your ears and be gone, boy. Fadarge squawked and slapped at me with her feathers. Jaime was smugly wearing my headphones as I ran for the door.